Early in my ministry, I had an elder who was once a preacher, and he just relished telling a story. He loved telling about how when someone would call him pastor, he'd launch into them. He'd give them a tongue lashing about how he was the preacher and the elders were the pastors, but don't call me the pastor because that's not what I am. Now, he may not have been wrong, but I suspect his message would have been better received without all the acid. The bigger question is, what are elders? There's a whole world out there that doesn't even know what that concept is, and yet it seems to be so familiar to us and in the New Testament. Now, we know what they are from numerous sermons about the qualifications of elders, but that's about the only time we ever hear about leadership in the church. Yet, we tend to harbor misconceptions, if you will, about elders. We put them on pedestals, and then we find out they're human, and they have humanity and feet of clay, like we do. And sometimes we're disappointed. We treat them like a complaint department or mini-gods who are there to make the world right for us, to take care of our every need, our every want, our every wish. They're the genie in the bottle in the church. But we're not the first to do such things. Peter writes this lesson about elders, and he uses 3 terms to describe them. I like this passage because this is the one place in the New Testament that you can see all the things that describe elders in one compact location. First of all, Peter calls them elders, which signifies insight and understanding, a certain amount of wisdom that goes with age. Then he turns to the word shepherd, which indicates the tender care the elders are to give. And finally, we come across the term overseer, which emphasizes responsibilities that go along with that. Yet, this passage comes from the agricultural world. Think about that background. The shepherd would tend sheep, making sure that they were fed and cared for. We call the scene pastoral. It's very calm. It's very peaceful. You feel the green grass in your soul. You can taste the water in your heart. So here's someone who protected them, and his gentle hand rubs over the wool of the sheep's back, and that becomes the thread that Peter uses in this lesson. Yet throughout church history until today, leadership has come from different fields. Imagine how this would have been different had this been written from the political position. Because politics is all about power. Getting and maintaining power and control. We would see an iron fist hammering Christians on their failings. Some want elders to do that. Or what if the image came out of the world of commerce, where the main concern was profits above people? Make sure this is running the right way. And we begin to see Christians as nothing more than machines that serve the interest of the third quarter projection. And we've done all that. When I was a boy, elders were appointed with an eye toward their business backgrounds. If a man was a successful businessman, if he owned his own business, if he was a vice president in a company, whatever it may be, we tended to make them elders. After all, isn't the church supposed to be run like a business? And yet, if you'll see from this passage, the answer might not be true. So Peter comes and he says, let's just go back to the pasture and lets him tenderly speak to elders of the churches that he speaks with. And he writes to encourage them. But as he does so, Peter addresses 3 questions that kind of float in our minds about elders as he goes through his encouragement. See, Peter opens this 5th chapter not with instruction, but exhortation. He says, "So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed." He uses that word exhortation that may be stronger than is necessary in the translation. But it's a word that leaves its track through almost every New Testament letter. It means to come alongside or to bolster. Instead of a wagging finger of blame, Peter would rather put his arm around the shoulders to lift them up. That's what the word means. See, the word exhort probably is better rendered encourage, for that's what Peter does in this passage. Why do they need this loving encouragement of someone who has borne the same burden of souls under his care? It's simply this. People were suffering. They needed someone to care for them when no one else would. No matter the time or the circumstances, people still need to know that someone cares about them as a person. Everyone needs to have somebody who knows their name and who knows their hurt and who can feel that hurt. Here, if the Christians only became members, persecution would decimate the church. The one truth that opens this passage is that shepherds need encouragement, just as we expect them to give it to us. See, serving as an elder is difficult. Most people don't think about that. They think position, they think importance, they think cushy. They do become complaint departments. Everybody who has a beef about anything tends to come up to them and wag in their ear. Not very helpfully, usually. But then they're expected to fix that problem before the evening service begins. There's this constant drip of water on concrete, and it creates a hole. But in the same way, the problems of leading wear a hole in the spirit of an elder at times. And they need someone to help deflect the drip, because discouraged elders abandon the sheep. I do know what the power of discouragement does. When I was in my first full-time ministry, the church I served was a real backbreaker. It wasn't the work that was hard. It was a smaller church, but it was the atmosphere. And it was a family church, and every issue became a family squabble. But I hadn't signed up for that. That was not my expectation. And so at least that's how a 23-year-old thinks. I don't think that way anymore. So I was seriously considering walking away from the ministry before it hardly ever began. I came home for Christmas, and there was a man at Waterview who had taught my teen Bible class. He was one of those genuine people who loved you and cared for you. And he said, let's visit sometime. And as we did, we talked, and he could recognize the tone of voice and the dejection that I felt. But he looked right through me and into me, and he said, don't quit, because you have too much ability to give up. We need you. And today, 43 years later, I'm here because someone was an encourager. And if elders grow discouraged, the church is damaged, because the sheep always are going to need a shepherd. Jesus saw that. He saw the result of people who didn't have anyone to guide them and care for them as people. In a world of theological experts who could give them all the right answers, people needed something more. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36, Jesus looks at these crowds, and it says, and he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. It's in the best interest of all Christians to have healthy elders who have someone to bolster them when they need it. So Peter takes the tone of the helper, not the lecturer. So he speaks to them with words of great personal significance. He says to them in verse 2, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. He tells them to shepherd the sheep. Now read between the letters of that word, shepherd, and you're going to see someone who cares for the sheep. He's the one that knows when they need rest. He's the one that knows when they need to move, when the grass is getting thin, when they're getting hungry. He leads them to pastures and protects them from wolves. You can never find a more personal word for a service like this than the word shepherd. And Peter knew it only too well. Because in this passage, there's a deep memory that haunts Peter as he speaks the words. After the resurrection, I think Peter still felt gun shy. After all, he had denied even knowing Jesus. Not just once, but 3 times, with great gusto and fervor. How could he ever go back and be what he was? So in John 21, he's eating breakfast. And Jesus strolls over and he sits down. And he starts asking me uncomfortable questions. Peter, do you love me? How do you answer that? He didn't know if Jesus could believe him or not. He can say the words, I love you, but they sound a little hollow in the echo of, I don't know the man. But Jesus peppered him with that question 3 different times. But the second was important, I think. After the second affirmation that comes out from Jesus' mouth, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know that I love you. That's when Jesus gives him a command, a particular command. John chapter 21, verse 16. Listen carefully. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. And he said, tend my sheep. Tend my sheep. Word for word. It's what Peter tells his elders. On Pentecost, he had to lead people in a new way. He had to help guide his fellow apostles as they faced explosive growth and the problems that threatened to rend the fledgling church into pieces. He knew what it was going to take to tend the sheep. But now, he's passing along the words of Jesus that were given to him to those who will take over. Shepherd the sheep. Care for the people. Tend their wounds. Feed them when they're hungry. Make difficult decisions when they're in jeopardy. This was the task of a faithful shepherd. And he expands the concept of shepherding sheep when he adds the phrase oversight. We usually make that a whole different area. And sometimes we're tempted to put the Roman view of supervisor on what Peter has to say. But that's too much authoritarian for the Jewish idea of oversight, at least in the agricultural context, because there it applies to what a shepherd does. He's watching over the flock. He's paying attention to the needs. When David reflected on his own experience as a shepherd, he said he maintained oversight. In the popular 23rd Psalm, he said, the Lord is my shepherd. He reflects on Jesus, on the Lord being a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. You see, he's watching the flock to see what their needs and their wants are. He cares for them when they're fatigued so they can rest. He watches for panting tongues to bring them to the pools of water to drink. He's paying attention. And such is the task of a shepherd. In short, shepherds care for the sheep so much that they sacrifice themselves for their needs. But there's a second question that arises in this passage, and that's, why does an elder do what he does? Motives count. Our motives propel our actions. If you ever know what drives a person, you understand their behavior better. Jesus made that observation. He looked around and he had these pristine Pharisees who did all these wonderfully good things, but they were pretty putrid when he looks at it. But he wants to talk to people not about the external cleansing of cups, rituals, being correct. He wants them to be morally right and righteous. So in Luke chapter 6 and verse 45, he says, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. And the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. It is in the heart that actions begin. It is in the motives that a person has that get expressed on the outside. And if you have impure motives, you can fake it for a little while. But soon, you'll be able to see what's really happening. And it will not be pretty. So what's in the heart of an effective elder? Peter says he's not driven by some things. He's not compelled to be an elder. An elder does not see his service as an unpleasant duty to get over. In verse 2, when he talks about shepherding the flock of God, he goes on to say, not under compulsion. And Peter puts a word in that context that no other inspired man dare use, because it speaks of coercion, of manipulation, of obligation. If you make an elder serve, he's certainly not going to do it well. Do you like to do things? Or do you do things well that you don't like to do? You may grumble the whole time, and you'll get to the very bare minimum if you have to before you finally quit. See, that happens. This, what Peter describes here, is an accurate thing. It happens. I've seen it happen. I've seen it in small churches especially, when they have fewer choices of elders. And elders really do need to be appointed, but there's only two who can be found who can serve, and one of them is old as Methuselah. And the fear is that if he dies, which appears apparent any day, it seems like, that church is going to be without elders. So someone who is not qualified at all, really, they show up on Sundays, they're a good person, they own a business in town, people like them, but they don't want to be an elder. In fact, they're not even cut out to be an elder. They get strong-armed into the job. Something like this is said, now, Brother Jones, I don't know what we're going to do if you don't become an elder, because this church is just going to die. Do you want the church to die? See, the manipulation is laid on thicker than mustard on a baseball game hot dog. And if he does serve, he's not going to help the church. He's going to hurt that congregation. Such is the problem when you compel men to serve. But Peter also says they don't do it for what he calls shameful gain, or at least that's what translations call it. That's an unusual word in the New Testament world. It's not used hardly at all in the New Testament, but other Greek writers use it for using obscene speech. Think about that. It describes someone who's cheap and chintzy and self-centered. He's only looking out for himself. It was said that some men would only go to the theater if you bought the ticket for them. And they would eat, but only if it meant that someone else was picking up the check. They wanted to find out a simple concept. What's in it for me? It's all they look at life for. And inevitably, someone out for shameful gain is looking out only for themselves and what they can get. The church never figures into the equation. If I can't get what I want, whether that be prestige or power or position or bragging rights or what I consider the right to do whatever I want to do, they don't want any part in it. And tragically, I've known men who have come into the eldership who only want to get something out of it and not put much into it. So instead, Peter describes the positive reasons that a man becomes an elder. First of all, he says he does it willingly. He's not under compulsion, but willingly. These are intentional and well-considered reasons that he wants to serve, is what that means. We meet that word in a negative context in Hebrews chapter 10, when people are turning away from the church. There, the Hebrew writer uses that term to describe their behavior. It's the same word that Peter uses. He says in Hebrews 10:26, for if we go on sinning deliberately, there's the word. They sin deliberately, knowing full well what they're doing. That's what this word means to Peter. They have the same kind of deliberation. They make an honest choice of whether they want to serve or not. They're not compelled. They're not talked into it. They're not pushed. They decide. But Peter also says they serve eagerly. Now, that's not rubbing your hands in glee, like thinking, wow, look and see what I can get. They don't say, if I ever get to be an elder, I'm going to straighten this church out. Because I've heard that phrase used in other places. Instead, it is zeal for the future. An eager man sees the possibilities and the opportunities as the open door in front of him. And he has this sense of positive optimism that I can do this. Now, we have a word that's it's opposite. It comes from the same root, but a different prefix. And that is the word posthumous. You know what posthumous means. It's when someone gets praise in retrospect. There, the zeal is in reverse. It's in the past. That's when we look back in the fondness of life. But Peter says, a man who wants to become an elder is looking forward with this sense of anticipation for his task. It becomes his privilege to serve because he has the heart to help and to serve and to care. But one last motive peeks out of verse 3. Now we're going to get to verse 3 in just a moment for the big part, but here's where the part about motive comes in. He says, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. Peter says that the people are in his charge. Now when we encounter that concept in other places, it's not describing the work of an elder, which is strange that Peter would apply it here. Because when Jesus is hanging on the cross, the soldiers are casting lots for his clothing. They're shooting dice to see who gets this exquisite handmade robe. They're not going to buy it. They're going to win it. It's going to be bestowed upon them because they're the winner. And so Peter takes that word to cast lots, and that's what the term is, to describe the people under the elder's care. Now, why is that? It doesn't make any sense, does it? That's because there's another way to use it. Now, Paul uses that same word this way in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 12. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. An inheritance is something you get because someone else gave it to you. Now, I've been blessed by an inheritance from both sets of parents, by what they earned. And I know one thing, and that is that it is not something that it was due me. It was something that was given into my hands to be used in the best possible way. That's how an elder feels about his duties. I have been given the privilege to care for these people by God. And I need to treat them the way God would treat them if he were doing it. See, God grants him the privilege to help and build people up. It's not an office that's held over heads or a superior position. It's really the concept of being a steward of a gift. And a capable elder is aware every day that the Lord has placed the flock in their hands and expects them to take care of it as God himself would take care of this church. That's a high bar to clear. But Peter doesn't leave without talking about one more thing. And that's the method of leadership. How does an elder lead? The history of the early centuries of the church showed a disturbing departure from the New Testament agricultural model of leadership. Instead of a shepherd over a flock, it began to mirror the organizational chart of the Roman government. Within a few short centuries, the concept of shepherd almost disappeared. Instead, you begin to read in church history the words bishop and archbishop and pope. It was the mirror image of Rome with its Roman Senate and its Roman emperor. And when they changed the paradigm, they changed the way they led. And a lot of that remains in place today, even though the structures are different. We tend, whether we like it or not, to mirror leadership off of one of two things. How Jeff Bezos leads Amazon, how businessmen do it, or how the president rules the country. The political model of power. And Peter wants to wash his hands of both. That's not the way elders are to lead. It's not about what the culture says is acceptable. He says it's something else. In verse 3 he says, not domineering over those in your charge. You know, Peter keeps hearing these echoes in his ear about what Jesus said. He remembers that quarrel on the road. When James and John wanted these chief positions, these positions of power, do you hear the political end of that? And Jesus instead turns it upside down, that the greatest of you will be the servant of all. But after that, he has to instruct his disciples on this. So in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 25, he says, so Jesus called them and he told them, he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, you hear the background? Lord it over them. And their great ones exercise authority over them. They used a simple method, lording over. And Jesus and Peter both bring that term together in leadership here. That's how the Gentile world does things. That's how the political world does things. That's how the business world does things. It's leadership at the end of a spear. Think about how you motivate people in a business. I threaten to fire you. It's like the old joke says, how long have you been working here? You say, ever since they threatened to fire me. Or in the political sphere, how do you maintain order? You send out the army if you have to, the National Guard. You at least have a police force and more than enough regulations to put someone in jail or to fine them great sums of money. It's sheer power. It is lording over. That's how the world does things. And everyone in Palestine knew that was a rule. If a Roman soldier came and he threw his pack at your feet, you were expected to carry it. Now there was a limit, but you had to carry it, and if you declined, your life was going to be threatened. Even if you reluctantly accepted it, you didn't like it. That's the picture behind what Jesus paints about loving enemies. And he says, so if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. See, he's expressing the fact that there is this leadership style called, I'm going to make you do it. I'm going to use my authority and my power. But today, command and threat replaces the spear. But Peter says no elder should demand compliance simply because he says so. It's not a power position that can coerce and punish. Because even if you get compliance, it won't last. There's that expression, when the cat's away, the mice will play. It's more true than you believe, because compliance is only there as long as there's enforcement. Instead, Peter has a different way to lead, one that's much more effective, but it's not as popular. Verse 3 goes on to say, you don't domineer over those in your charge, but you're an example to the flock. Examples replace commands. An elder shows you how to live, how to worship, how to teach. He demonstrates care in their care. You know what to do by watching them. They would never be able to say, do as I say and not as I do, because people will do as they do. Because you can look at an elder and you're going to see what the church is going to become by watching what he does. And after all, human beings really don't follow very good instructions. They follow examples. And Peter already said one time, if you need an example of how to suffer, all you have to do is look at Jesus, using the same terminology. And so watch what he did, do what he did. Jesus will show you how. And so Peter draws this contrast of two forms of leadership. There is this leadership that flows from the position. When the emphasis on my authority, I can make you do things. I will do it by fiat power if I have to. Now, we understand that. You know, if you're driving 70 in a 60 zone and you take the crest of a hill, and down at the bottom of the hill there is a car that you take for a police car, you know what you're going to do then. You're going to tap the brake. Why? Because they have the power of law to compel compliance. But once you go by and you're out of sight, you also know what you do. You go back to the gas pedal and bring it back up. I always like the creative approach on some of these things. There's a private beach in Florida that instead of posting a regular no trespassing sign, violators will be prosecuted, he posted a sign that said, please do not feed our sharks, because they just love swimmers. The second form of leadership, though, outside of the compliance and the authority that Peter doesn't ascribe to, is the form of leadership of influence. It doesn't rely on threats to command compliance. Instead, it inspires. And it provides the good reason and the good pattern for what and how to do right. I think it's best illustrated by something that Dwight Eisenhower said. Eisenhower had served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He planned and executed the D-Day invasion of France. And following that, he had a fabulous career of various things, including 2 terms as the United States President. After he was retired, Walter Cronkite went to his Gettysburg farm and he interviewed him. In the interview, Cronkite asked him, what's the secret to leading men? Now, he didn't answer directly. He didn't give some glib answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and he fished out a string and he laid it on the table. And he said, well, if you take this string and you push it with your finger, it doesn't go anywhere. But then he stopped and he asked, well, what happens if you pull it? If you take that same string and pull it, it will go wherever you want it to go. When leaders go first, people follow them. Elders do have authority, but it doesn't come from their position. It comes from their life and their influence. And if their influence is not strong, their authority doesn't matter for much. They can't tell people what to do. They have to take them by the hand and go with them. And usually they have gone first and they say, I know the way. Never underestimate the power of an example. Because people watch elders and they'll do more than they're willing to do simply because someone has inspired them, someone has helped them, someone has shown them, someone takes them by the hand and walks to the kingdom with them. Now, even though we say we don't want to be rewarded for something, we don't do anything without a reason. That'd be like banging your head against the wall until your ears bleed. Some people want extrinsic rewards. They want the acclaim, the adoration, the crowd. They'll grow petulant when they're criticized. You're not giving me what I want. Some are motivated by intrinsic rewards, such as a job well done or personal satisfaction. Peter says that elders who serve well will be rewarded. On Judgment Day, he says they'll be rewarded the victor's crown. The winners of the game would have a laurel wreath placed on their head and paraded through the city and acclaimed as the champion. Yet this special symbol of victory would soon wither and die. It was short-lived and quickly forgotten. Instead, Peter elevates the role of elders by describing the reward that's given at the same time. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory, a crown that doesn't wither and die. It's never forgotten. It's always praised by God. You see, faithful elders may have very little on earth. They may get very few acclaim. They may get a lot of blame. But they'll receive something more substantial, the recognition of the chief shepherd, because they recognize that they are a shepherd who serves only another shepherd. And if that shepherd gives his nod, everything they've done is worth it. That's a reward that's worth more than anything else. Our lesson this morning emphasizes the importance of leadership. And without it, the church wanders until it finds itself in a grave. It's vital to talk about that because the church rises or falls to the level of its leaders. It will never exceed them. Without godly men who care for the needs of the people, the church grows cold, becomes dormant, and a distant memory of what it once was. So Peter encourages elders, and we should follow his lead. But how do you encourage an elder? I think one thing is just to understand that they're only men. I think one of the great misconceptions are that elders are something better than we are, and yet they're men with emotions, with feelings. They grow tired, they grow hungry, they grow weary, they get depressed, they get beaten down, just like you and I do. So treat them the way you want to be treated. If you don't want somebody pounding on you, don't pound on them. Recognize they have family, they have jobs, and cut them some slack. Treat them the way you want to be treated, and understand that they're just men. They and you will feel a lot of relief from that. The second is to talk to them, not about them, and tell them the truth when you do. One of the most challenging things about serving as an elder is the criticism. In fact, one reason we have problems finding elders is because the stories are told and are shared by how badly we treat elders at times. And a lot of times that criticism is silent. It's a silent assassination. It takes place in coffee shops or dinner tables. It's the griping and complaining people do about elders. But instead of talking about an elder, don't talk to him. If you have difficulties, if you're seeing something different, if something's bothering you, or if you have questions, talk to them. They'll talk to you. But also, tell them the truth. Now, my experience has been that people tend to avoid telling elders precisely what they think because they don't want to hurt their feelings. And that's admirable, but it doesn't help. I've known people who've left churches, and if an elder calls and says what happened, they'll never give the real reason they left. They'll make one up. But elders can't serve well if they don't have adequate information. Now, you don't have to be ugly about it. You don't have to be accusatory. But you have to be frank. Here's how I feel. Here's what I'm seeing. And make sure it's not about them, but about what's going on with you. Because much of their work is never known. And many times it's never appreciated. but it's not unnoticed. I like to listen to songs that inspire me, and there's one that keeps me going. It's a song called Thank You. It describes what happens to the unseen when they get to judgment, when they think their life has not made much of a difference, when they've had more defeats than victories. They hear an interesting thing in heaven. The final verse says, one by one they came, as far as the eye could see, each one somehow touched by your generosity. Little things that you've done, sacrifices made, unnoticed on the earth, heaven now proclaims. And I know up in heaven, they're not supposed to cry, but I was almost sure that there were tears in your eyes. And Jesus took your hand, and you stood before the Lord. And he said, my child, look around you, for great is your reward. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am a life that was changed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am so glad that you gave. Thank you for joining me today. And I hope you have a great day and a great week. See you later.